Hey, PLO 5 Card Mastermind, how is it going? My name is Ryan, and today we are going to be doing a bit of a session review, mainly looking at hands where we have a bluff catcher on the river, or we have a river spot facing a bet, and I brought along Fabian to do this video. So thanks for being here,
Hello.
Fabian.
Hey,
A-
glad to be here.
And so every hand that I've put in here, I've run the sims from the turn and river, and I'll sort of talk a little bit about what I've sort of noticed, and also ask Fabian some questions and see what he sort of thinks before I give, I guess, like the answer or anything like that. So we'll jump straight into the first hand here. We have Ace, King, King, 6, 4 triple suited. It's going to be an open from under the gun. If my hand was slightly worse, I would certainly look to fold it if the fold was a deuce, but I think even triple suited with the king as the as one of the triple suited cards, we can still open this one. I will quickly say, be very careful about the suits in your hand. I've mentioned this in other videos, but it does play a big role, especially in these fringe hands, when you're looking to open a hand pre-flop. Whether, say, we had the 6 of clubs instead of the king of clubs, that can make a big difference in some scenarios, for example. But anyway, moving on, we get called in the big blind tier, and we go to a flop of 8, 7, 3, two-toned, rainbow, I should say, and our opponent checks to us, and we have a decision to make. So, Fabian, what would sort of be your thought process on the flop here?
Well, first thing is probably that Big Blind is supposed to do a fair amount of leading here, and we have to evaluate if that's what he's doing or not. So because this obviously impacts our c betting strategy, I would say. So when he's supposed to lead a fair amount and then never leads, we should c bet quite a bit tighter. And then the second thing is, or like to me, this hand is pretty much always a check back. It's not that I'm super excited about like an overpair and a gut shot. Like in 4-card below, it's a decent hand, but in 5-card below, like the main reason why I'm checking back is because, well, first of all, I don't want to bet fold my hand, but second of all, I just have too little blockers to bet. I think I would rather want to have like a 9 in my hand or a 7 and 8 or both preferably. And then this one I just check back and play a turn, I guess.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I took away from everything that I've seen. We should also, the out of position play here, he should be leading sort of almost 40% of his range on this board texture.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And I certainly think that most players aren't leading anywhere near that. And also, even if they were leading at a reasonable frequency, I think their strategy would be a lot different to what the solver is doing. So I think something worth considering is checking back a little bit more. And as you said, this hand, regardless, makes for a perfect check back for the reason that you mentioned. We don't.
What? Sorry.
No, you.
What lead size did you put in the sim?
I
Or
put a
is
70.
it in the trainer?
No, this one I ran myself. And I put a 75% sizing for the flop, which is what we use in the trainer. So I thought it would be.
I've seen in 4-card on some of these boards, and I think this probably applies to 5-card as well here, that out of position actually likes to lead pot. I think that makes a lot of sense for out of position here, because it's not like the smaller we go, we can't just add more and more hands, because at some points it's kind of uncomfortable for us to bet that many hands out of position. And the hands we like to bet, like pretty much hands like 2-pair need a lot of protection here on this flop, or like maybe protection is the wrong word, but like they basically want to build a big pot, and then, or they just like they want to put a hand like ours here into a tough spot. Like, I mean, if they pot, like we probably still have to call because we have the gut shot, but it's not as clear as in 4-card PLO, and because it's gonna happen so often. You have a hand like 7, 8, 8, 3, or whatever. Turn is a queen, a jack, a king, and then you need to check, and then you have very difficult decisions depending on your backup. So you don't mind just taking down the pot on the flop already.
Yeah, I think that's
very often. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, especially when like our range is going to be so overpair heavy that putting those hands in a tough spot is going to be obviously what we want with a lot of our range. and facing a pot sizing, like you're saying, even this hand, which has like the backdoor nut flush draw and the gut shot, is kind of put in a tough spot.
Yeah.
Especially if we're playing against a player that probably isn't leading as much. So I think something interesting to think about there in regards to sizing. But we do end up checking back, and the turn comes the 3 of clubs. And so on this 3 of clubs, obviously we've checked back on the flop, and our opponent, he's going to have more of the sets, more of the hands like 7-3, 8-3, so full houses now. And also, given our pre-flop range, we also don't have a lot of 3x. So I would say on this turn, our opponent, he wants to be using a large sizing because he's trying to leverage his polarity, and we have all the overpairs that basically he's trying to push towards indifference with a large sizing. Would you say that's sort of like how you would play this spot as out of position?
Yeah. I think sometimes you can also make a case for a super small sizing where basically just targeting like the air from the under the gun player. So you basically you never expect him to fold an overpair against. For example, let's say you bet something like one big blind here.
Mm-hmm.
Then I mean, first, of course, we don't have fold equity against the overpairs, but we're also not facing a larger bet by the overpairs or by other parts of the range.
Mm-hmm.
And under the gun still has like some ace high hands or some other hands that maybe even fold against such a small size. So I think it. I mean, I didn't run this obviously, but my my out of the box mind for these or like in this spot like kind of likes the small size as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think the good thing about using the small size as well is if our opponent, so the imposition player, if he is playing a very linear strategy on the flop, it's certainly going to punish that a lot more, especially on the river when the board texture changes, and we can just start basically aggressively betting the river and forcing him to fold like way more than he should because his range, if he's betting too merged on the flop, then he's going to struggle on the turn as well, but also the river, to really respond to our line. So, and sort of betting small enables us to do that more often, which is something interesting to sort of think about. But anyway, I ran a sim. The sim I ran here was the the out of position player using a 75% pot sizing. You could maybe argue for even larger, but that's sort of what I ran with. And he isn't supposed to be betting too much, as you can imagine. Yes, he is going to have he's going to have more strong made hands here than us, but it's not like so big. He only bets around 30% of his range, and then for 75%, and that's kind of what my opponent did. I tended to sort of base as well the sims on what my opponent was sizing, just so we could sort of get an accurate representation of how we should respond. And we can also talk about like how we can deviate or how other players should deviate. And in terms of our decision on the turn, so we're not really folding that frequently. We're only folding around 30% of the time with our entire range, not really raising too much. And in terms of like the categories that you might be unsure about, so for example, aces here really doesn't fold much at all. It only folds around 5%, but it is still folding a little bit. And obviously, as we sort of decrease in our overpairs, we tend to do a little bit more folding. So kings is folding around 20% here. And then some hands that I would say the lowest EV calls here are hands like king, king, queen, queen, 4. So a hand like a bare double overpair with no flush draw. Or even a hand like king, queen, 10, 6, 5 with the king high flush draw. So we have the king high flush draw and the open-ended straight draw with basically no showdown value. Those are hands that are very fringe in terms of calling. So just a bit of perspective there. And I think our hand is a pretty straightforward call. You would agree as well, Fabian?
Yes. Not much else to do. I mean, I think you said it right. There's almost no, or like very little raising, and I don't see why we would want to raise this hand.
Yeah. There were some interesting bluff raises with kind of similar hands, but they all contained hands like an 8, or especially they want to have hands like 8-7, so like a hand like king, king, 8-7. If that was to check back on the flop, that would be a potentially decent hand to raise on the turn. But for the most part, we're not really doing much raising. And again, I think our hand is a pretty straightforward call, so we do end up calling. And the river comes the queen of clubs, our opponent. on the river elects to bet into us for around about, I guess, two thirds or so, or maybe it's about three quarters, around that sizing, and we sort of have a decision to make with our hand. So, what are your sort of thoughts here um, on the river?
I mean, first of all, having 3 clubs, I think is kind of nice because if he like, the more clubs he has, the less likely he is to bluff, basically, and so, um, that makes it a better hand to bluff catch for us, but we don't block any board pair, of course, and when he sizes this big, I think, like, I think our club blockers don't matter as much anymore, or, like, he not saying he's not value betting a flush like this, but we block all the flushes that he could value bet like
Yeah.
this, and I even doubt, like, a king high flush is going for value like this against an under the gun range. Um, kind of a little bit weird, like, from just based from my experience, like, I it's so hard for people to just bluff in these spots. It feels like
Mm,
we have the most obvious bluff catching spot, like, and people don't just like to punt it in there.
mm,
And if they do, they pot it, I think. So, although I have sometimes seen, like, with this, like, for me, this his size also doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, any
yeah.
boat should be good enough to bet pot. Um, any thin value bet should probably bet smaller than this. Um, and sometimes this sizing, these random sizes mean just like, if they don't make a lot of sense for value, then they're just bluffs. That's sometimes what it is.
Mm,
But without knowing the player at all or anything, like, I'm not ready to make that read probably. So maybe I'll even just fold here and be like super nitty.
mm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, like on the river here, I would agree that his sizing doesn't really make a lot of sense because um, if he does have a full house, he really just wants to bet like pot, and then like if he has say like the ace, like the nut flush or the second nut flush, he probably doesn't really want to bet this size. He wants to bet like a 1/3 sizing, and that's generally what the solver uh, basic kind of wants to do here. He wants to bet pot with his full houses, and then with
Hmm.
his flushes, he can bet a small sizing. He doesn't really use this like 2/3, 3/4 sizing. It doesn't make sense
Hmm.
for him. So it's sort of interesting to face this size in the river, and I think the fact that we have like three clubs here, it does like remove some hands that he might elect to bluff. If we have so like because we have, I don't think like you said he's not probably not value betting a nut flush here, um, or a king high flush. So having those sort of cards isn't ideal if we have like especially the king of clubs. I think is like not gonna really be a hand that he's gonna value bet the king high flush, but then he probably uses it as a bluff. And then we don't really have a board pair. I do elect to sort of make the fold here. And in theory, like this hand is probably a call for the most part. We're not really folding the nut flush on the river versus this
Hmm.
particular sizing.
Hmm.
Having said that, the solver really isn't using this size on the river. And I think I should say as well, we're never folding trips for this size on the river, which I think makes a lot of sense. And in terms of like our weakest bluff catches here, it's going to be a hand like we would prefer to call maybe a hand like ace ace 8 or ace ace 7 with the ace of clubs, rather than call this hand. I would say like I mean that's what the solver is doing, and I think I can see merit as to why it's sort of choosing to do that. And like you said, I don't really think that there is like a ton of bluffs here, or at least I don't expect my opponent to be like happy to bluff this spot when the clubs comes in, and it's really easy
Hmm.
for us to have the nut flush on the river.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. It's different. Maybe if it's like, or like, if the river's like the 9 of clubs or whatever, maybe it's a little bit different. Um, because then, like, it's kind of scary. Although I don't know, like, yeah, people just don't bluff a lot. But one thing I want to stress here again is the river bet sizing, and because it's something that I see um people misapply quite a lot, or they just do it wrong in 4 card and in 5 card, and it's like when you're out of position on the river, like 95% of the time you want to have a small size, a block size that's either like a third of the pot or even smaller, and then you want to have a full pot size bet. There's very rarely spots where you bet like 50, 60, 70% of the pot, and I see people do this quite a lot, and maybe they do it exploitively, but I would say whenever you have a river decision out of position, try to think about what is my value range and how large would my value range like to bet, basically, or how strong is my value range compared to my opponent's range. And yeah, and so usually, yeah, go with two sizes, a small size and a big size, but don't do this in between stuff. It usually doesn't accomplish a lot.
Yeah, definitely. And like if you think about using a small sizing on the server, which the ad position play is supposed to do a lot more than he is using pod, for example. Not only does it sort of enable him to bet hands like the nut flush, hands like even the king high flush for value, but he like puts a lot of hands that we have in a very tough spot. If we have a hand like an overpair with no pair blocker and like say one club, that hand is sort of put in a difficult spot. Whereas against this sizing, I have a very easy time folding a lot of my range. I'm not really put in a difficult spot a lot of the time. Whereas that small sizing, it's more, I guess it's going to make our range or put us in a tough spot more often than not, and that is going to be beneficial for playing against a human player a lot of the time. So that's sort of the end of that hand. We don't get to see what our opponent had, so we'll move on to the next one. So here we have Queen Queen at 10-9-6 on the button, folds to us. We raise, and our opponent in the big blind is going to elect to call. He's sitting a little bit shallower, so something to keep in mind. And on the flop here, it checks to us. We have a very standard c-bet, I would say. Unfortunately, in this hand, I did check back. I probably tried to get a little bit fancy. I figured that we would have some checkbacks with queens and then also having the 9 as well. But I think here, for the most part, we're generally the top sets that we actually check back in a spot like this are going to be hands that have like top set and a 9, and then maybe like a flush draw, like a nut flush draw or something like that. But don't really like slow play too much of our top sets on flop.
Yeah, but I would say this probably changes when like depending on the stack size. So when we're playing 50 big blinds deep here, or I mean he has 42 behind, we have a lot more value in c-betting also our weaker top sets because he needs less equity or to stack off, or like he's more incentivized to play an aggressive check raising strategy, and so we can get it in quite a bit with our top sets against against the weaker parts of his range, right? So this leads to a little bit more c-betting with top sets, or like slight different types of top sets that are going to c-bet. For example, usually at lower SPRs, you also see that there is more slow playing going on with like this with like the very strong hands. Whereas when you have a very strong top set with a lot of backup here on the spot, at 100 big blinds deep, sometimes you will check back, but in general, you want to build a pot because there's still other hands that could call. Whereas when you're this short, you can still like check back and jam the turn and get stacks in very easily. So,
yeah, something worth considering for sure. Like being aware of the effective stack on the flop, but that's okay. We do end up checking back, as I mentioned, unfortunately, and the turn comes the 3 of clubs. And Fabian, you sort of did a video on this, talking about how both players sort of approach this spot, but mainly sort of the out of position player. Do you sort of briefly just want to mention what you were talked about there?
Yeah, I mean I think most of the players will have seen the video by now, but it's basically you're supposed to bet quite small here out of position, and that can be a size like a third, could even be smaller. And the idea is basically you don't really have like a big advantage in flushes, like although maybe at this stack size it changes again a little bit, but in general you're saying, okay, you check back or when the in position player checks back the flop, he can certainly do this with a flush draw, he can certainly do this with a nut flush draw, And a lot of people think like, okay, he checked back, so he doesn't have his strong flush draw combinations. And that's true, but he doesn't need a strong flush in order to call you down. He can just call down the mediocre flushes, and then yeah, you can't just go nuts and just pot everything here. So what you want to do is bet small, because you will have an advantage usually in the amount of sets that you have and the amount of good two pairs that you have. So when you have, or even the amount of two pairs, your opponent usually has a reasonable amount of two pairs, but you will have hands like Queen Jack 10-9, whereas your opponent probably checks back a hand like, I don't know, Ace Ace Queen 7, for example, and so on. So his two pairs will have way less playability and way less straight draws, which actually matter even if it's a flushing turn here. So the general idea is for out of position, he should bet small with a reasonable frequency. Yeah, and many draws. For example, if the out of position player has a rep here, or he has an like, I don't know, a pair with an open ender and so on, these hands do very poorly as a check call. Like they don't really want to bet check call, but they can go for a small bet and then um, still like they see a cheap river because in position almost never raises, and then they still have the chance to get there on the river, and of course they have the immediate fold equity as well. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And our opponent here didn't watch your video, and he elects to bet quite big, which again we've talked about doesn't really make much sense for his range. And he's sort of saying that he has a very strong flush on the turn with this sizing. And I think the other thing that makes betting small really good in a spot like this is that from my perspective here, I have quite it's much easier for me to play my range versus a big sizing than it is versus a small sizing. Here, I can pretty much comfortably call like all my sets, all of my strong two pairs, and then some of my other two pairs with like a club. Oh, sorry, a spade in this example. It's very easy for me to play that hand, and I can just fold everything else. Whereas a small sizing is going to make it very difficult when I have like a top pair or an over pair with like with like an open ender or something like that.
Yeah, against this size, even if you have a hand like Ace Ace King 6-5, it's like somewhat of an easy fold if you don't have a high spade. But if your opponent bets really small, then you probably need to call. You probably even need to call with a hand like Ace Ace King 5-4, where you only have the bottom gut shot. And so, and those hands are put into a really tough spot, and you will be able, as the out of position player, to get some value from your Queen 9s, Queen 7s, pocket 3s, and so on.
Yeah, exactly. So versus sizing, again, I ran a sim here, and pretty much we're calling like most of our strong two pairs, like Queen 7, Queen 3 plus is always calling, and then we're calling some of like the other two pairs with like good backup or blockers, and some over pairs with good backup and blockers. Again, pretty straightforward, or at least it becomes a lot easier for us to defend against this sizing, and I obviously end up calling the turn. We don't ever have a raising range here as well. Like you've mentioned before, like our opponent is representing a polarized range. There's kind of like not really much incentive for us to have a raising range, especially when the SPR is like this small as well. It's not like we're worried about losing value with our strongest hand. So we elect to call, and the river comes the 8 of clubs, so bringing in quite a few straights, but not bringing in a full house. And our opponent elects to effectively pot the river, and I end up folding, and it's, I think, like pretty straightforward fold, but I did think it was a hand that was worth bringing up because it's very important on the river to think in a spot like this much more about, okay, our opponent is representing a polarized range, and not, I think I see a lot of players sometimes against like some weaker players that I maybe play against is they get too attached to a hand in 5 card. They think I have a set or something along these lines, and they don't want to fold on the river or in a spot like this. I think it's very important to think less about when your opponent is polarized. Think less about your overall hand strength. Okay, yes, you obviously want to beat his bluffs, but it's much more about the blocker effects that you have in your hand, and not having a spade in our hand is very, very problematic on the river because our opponent's value range is basically the second nut flush or better. And not blocking that, we are always folding, and the solver is always folding the river without a spade, even versus a small size, which he doesn't really use on the river because he's trying to be polar, but I think that's worth bringing up for sure.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's just so easy for us to have one spade in our hand in 5 card pillow. So yeah, no need to call this hand. Although it looks kind of um looks like a sexy bluff catcher because we block everything that has showdown value. Um, but yeah, still we don't have a spade, so we just fold.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I like to do in terms of like I would say like our strategy on the river versus this sizing, or versus a pot sizing, I should say. We do fold some flushes, although not that many. We're never folding a hand like that has 3 spades here, for example.
Hmm.
And we are sometimes folding the second nut flush around 15% of the time, and we prefer to call with hands like you're saying, like this kind of hand looks like a sexy bluff catch because we block like the showdown value. And when we have a flush blocking, like say a queen, it's a very high frequency call on the river because we basically make it more likely that, well, basically our opponent, he doesn't want to bluff with a hand like a queen on the river because that's the kind of hand he wants to fold. So therefore, if he's never bluffing a queen, it makes it more likely basically more likely that we block his value with a queen. I'm probably
Yeah,
butchering the explanation, but basically we uh it's more likely he's
basic.
value betting, bluffing, I should say.
Yeah, that's correct.
And
Um,
yeah, anything else you'd like to sort of add on the river?
no, I think that's totally fine.
Cool. All right, we'll move on to the last hand. And here, this hand, in my defense, was played quite a while ago, so please forgive the awful pre-flop mistake here of calling this hand. But we unfortunately do call this hand, but it should be pretty standard 3-bet. And you guys will see this in pretty much every spot pre-flop here, like versus a single open raise. Hands like this, King Jack 10 8 7, or very similar hands are going to be 3-bets. They have a very smooth equity distribution. If they have some fold equity, obviously like pushing out some hands like Ace King with like 3 hearts here is very good. And we should generally be looking to 3-bet this hand class, but unfortunately I don't. Anyway, we go to a flop of Jack Jack 4. We check. In theory, we can have some leads here, but it's like a very small amount, like maybe 10 to 15%. It's a very like mixed strategy. I generally prefer to basically just check my entire range, and I think a lot of players are playing relatively similar. We do
Hmm.
check. Our opponent uses a 1/3 sizing, and we have the first decision on the flop. What would you do here, Fabian?
Mm, I think I like raising here with my combo. Um,
Interesting.
I mean, having spades is also kind of like it's a little bit of an overkill. And also, I mean, but still, like the thing is, the spades give us some extra equity against a hand like Ace Jack. Um, and also we just have 4 overs to the 4. So, and the thing is, we actually don't have that often. You might think, okay, it's 5 card pillow, but I mean, here this is also a hand that is that was supposed to 3-bet pre-flop. And if you think about the other hands with the jack that have 4 overs here, a lot of those combinations will actually be 3-bets pre-flop. I mean, of course, not if we have the bad suits, but very often we will also have a hand like Ace Jack 3 or like the same hand here with a dangler that's lower or whatever. So we also can easily have an undercard. And so when we have 4 overs to the second pair,
Mm.
um, I definitely like check raising. I'm not check raising all these hands all the time, but I would say I'm check raising these hands like 70 to 80% of the time probably.
Yeah, okay. So like for me here, I would in game I elected to call, and I still agree with my decision. Um, Generally speaking, like we don't really like on in 5 card we don't really raise a ton of trips, and our hand does have 4 overcards here,
Hmm.
which is obviously good. But the other characteristic of a raising hand with trips on the flop here is going to be hands like unblock the draws, because the problem here is that we're at a high SPR scenario, and as soon as we start racing, we very much narrow our opponent's range. And yes, we do have 4 overcards, But it becomes quite difficult to play if we check raise and say the turn is a card that doesn't bring us the. I'm not talking about so much with this hand in particular because there's a lot of good turn cards here, but
Mhm.
there can be quite a few weak ones. If we start raising too many weak trips here and the board
Mhm.
runs out over cards that we don't have, it becomes very difficult to play our hand against aggression. The other thing as well is to think sort of like, what do we sort of gain here from um, raising with a hand with a flush draw? There's kind of like not all that much incentive if we don't have like a ton of strong overcards. And our hand in the solver is going to be a call. If we had like no spade or even just one spade, we would elect to raise this hand. But yeah, having like you're saying the four overcards is very, very good. But I think here there is kind of like there's obviously some incentive to check raise our hand, but I think
Mhm.
if we start narrowing, I think also in practice as well, people aren't going to call as wide as they aren't going to bet call as wide as the solver will. So their range on the turn and the river becomes very, very narrow. Um, so even though I do like check raising here some of the time, I think this particular hand I want to call.
What check raise size did you give?
Half pot.
Oh, okay, okay.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
In general, I think you want to go small. Could even go smaller than this, maybe.
Mhm.
But um, I would say like I still like the decision. Like I still don't mind raising here because we also don't block the nut flush draw, which is kind of important. We don't block aces. And uh there's definitely some hands worse than a jack that can bet call here, even in 5 card.
Mm.
Um, and the thing is, maybe that's also a little bit of a misconception that a lot of people have is that like when we raise for value here in the flop, we need to be able to go for 3 streets, but that's totally not the case. Like it can very like this hand could very well be a hand that check raises flop checks turn in order to protect our checking range on the turn a little bit, right?
Mm.
Um, so I see it with the 2 spades that it's kind of like a little bit of an overkill to raise this hand, but um, um, yeah, it's something that I've seen in other sims or also basically that out of position you very often want to raise the hands that have a lot of equity, and then the spades actually add some equity here to us, even if it's to our hand. So um, although I don't I still don't hate the check raise, but
Mm.
I have to respect the solver line, of course. When the
Yeah.
solver says
Yeah,
you
it wouldn't
can't
be
do that.
I don't think it would be like really that much of a mistake. It's more just like a very like you identified like the main characteristics of a check raise, which is going to be like
Yeah.
having those overcards because that is so important when we do start narrowing our opponent's range.
Also, it's something to think about is like, let's say, um, let's say we would like, let's say you see me check raising this hand and we play against each other every day in the pool. What would your adjustment be? How would you exploit that I'm check raising this hand?
Oh yeah, asking the question. I thought it was rhetorical. I would. I mean, there's not really like too much I'm gonna think about it because it's not like a huge deviation. Like it's not like I'm gonna be like,
Yeah,
okay, now I know that you're check raising more of your like weaker jack X. I'm gonna start betting, what is it, less mergy. I'll probably bet more of my jack X that would otherwise check back. I'm not really gonna make that
yeah,
adjustment here if I see your
yeah,
play. Um,
yeah. And I mean, that's kind of the thing. So I think like having and also a lot of the time with these hands, like that's usually what I tell myself. People will probably know if they've seen other some other of my videos, but you will probably also miss some of the check raises because um or like some of the value check raises because the solver will um at a certain frequency also check raise like a weaker jack X some of the time. But if
mm,
you, for example, with an undercard to the four or whatever, but if you just never check raise these hands, then on average your check raising frequency will be a little bit too low, or you will be a little bit too passive. So having some of these hands in there, like going a little bit over aggressive with these hands, is probably fine because you're probably missing some of them on the other end. On the other end, you know.
mm, yeah, definitely. So in the hands, I do elect to check call. Turn comes the five of spades. And I would say, like, yes, okay, we did check call the flop, But the five of spades is actually quite a decent card for us overall. So it doesn't improve hands like aces and kings that our opponent could potentially bet, or improve a hand like ace jack. I'm talking about our entire range, I should say. And he also shouldn't be like betting all of his safe like strong flush draws. He should be checking some of them back. Whereas like our strong flush draws are gonna call a lot of the time. Like we're probably never folding at nut flush draw, and most of our king high flush draws are calling for the most part on a board like this. So like we do actually turn a lot of equity, and we talked a bit about before how we're not really check raising like all of our Jack X here. On the flop, we still have a lot of hands that are going to protect themselves. Even a hand like Jack 4 as well is going to call the flop quite a bit here, because if it doesn't have, again, like strong overcards, it does not really want to start narrowing our opponent's range. So we do turn a lot of flushes here. In fact, like we very rarely have a hand that is worse than like a Jack basically on the turn. And we end up checking which we should do with our entire range, and our opponent elects to bet 2/3. So on the turn we have like what is to me like a pretty standard call. I would say we're basically never folding Jack X here, and our opponent, he's sort of saying he has like a strong flush or a full house here. And anything you would sort of like to add to this?
I think it was just interesting the way you build it up. It sounded totally like we were supposed to have a small lead here sometimes, but then you're like, oh no, we're just checking out entire range, because it sounded like the turn cut is actually decent for us. And maybe, I mean, did you just range check in the solver, or did you give him a small size?
I believe I started the sim with like a small sizing, like 50% maybe, or 33%. But I think the problem here is that although we do call a lot of flushes, like, and although we do have like quite a bit of Jack X, our opponent still has that polarity advantage, and that's what really matters in the high SPR scenario. And like maybe if I gave him like a very, very small sizing, like 20%, there could be some leading, but also he's going to have hands like aces with the nut flush draw a lot as well. So I think that's important to remember.
Yeah, of course he's gonna have these hands, but I think if we want to lead, we really want to lead small. Like 50% would be way too big.
Yeah,
and maybe 33 is even big. I think leading something like 15 or 20% could work really well, because it's again the same spot. Like we're not really trying to apply pressure to the nut flush here, or to a jack or whatever. These hands are going to call anyway. But we could sometimes have a bluff as well, or we could sometimes want something value. For example, if we bet like really small here, he probably needs to call like aces with just one spade, sometimes. And that's like really uncomfortable for him. And at the same time, when we have a hand like this, like let's say he has the nut flush here, and we lead something like three big blinds in here. He's only going to call most of the time, and we don't have to check call an eight big blind bet. So there's definitely some upside as well for a small lead. I'm not sure like how, like I could see this happening, but it will not be like a super high frequency. But I could see that it's a thing like some of the time for a small size.
Yeah, I certainly see it as well. Like, I talked a little bit about this in like a 4-card video, whereas like we reviewed a hand where you did lead for like one big blind or whatever it was. And like, if we can push our, or basically if we can make, like you're saying with, for example here, if our opponent has the nut flush, well now he's just going to call out like 2 or 3 big blind bet instead of us facing this large sizing. If he is going to be much more passive against this small lead than he would be if we checked, that's obviously going to be extremely good for us. And even though the solver might say it only leads like, I don't know, like 20% here for a very small sizing, you could then advocate, because you're basically realizing your equity more, you're seeing the river for cheaper, you're preventing your opponent from basically leveraging his polarity as much as he would if we checked. You can then say, okay, we can start leading here for a much higher frequency. And it's certainly something interesting to think about, especially when it's very sort of unexpected. People don't know how to react to it as well.
And
there you go.
No, go ahead.
That's all I had to say.
Oh, okay. Yeah, one more thing. That's the thing that happens frequently in 4 card, but also in 5 card, is that people tend to or the solver c-betting strategy is usually somewhat polarized for the in-position player. But in reality, many people struggle to find the right bluffs, but instead they bet more depolarized for thinner value or for more protection with their overpairs and so on a lot here. And so against the solver strategy, there's less incentive to to lead, because he's like his air is gonna fold anyway, and his his strong hands they don't mind lead like when he leads or when villain leads into us, right? But when our opponent suddenly has like a lot of kings and aces here in this spot that he's not supposed to have, he will really struggle dealing with such a small lead size.
Yeah, definitely. So we, again, obviously facing this bet, we have a pretty straightforward call. We are supposed to fold quite a few of our flushes here, around 50% of the time. And it's also important to keep in mind that it's not just like we're calling any random flush draw on the flop. Like I said before,
Mm-hmm.
like a bare queen high flush draw is probably not going to call the flop a ton unless it has like some kind of like reason to, like a backdoor flush draw with ace king queen or something like that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Even some of the very, very weakest nut flush draws are actually going to be folding. And we generally would prefer to call a hand that is basically having a flush with like a redraw, so like an overpair like kings or queens with like any flush,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of how high it is, or like 5-4 or a jack, for example. And I think it's also important to say that the in-position play here, he should actually be betting a lot of his jack X on the turn that doesn't have a full house or a flush.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Also, maybe not something that I think you would necessarily see from a lot of people. But because we're supposed to be folding a lot of flushes, and because he can get protection from a hand like a straight draw, like an overpair and a straight draw, getting like an overpair and a wrap to fold is okay. I mean, it's decent. It's not like we're folding for a ton of equity, but it's still okay.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, he benefits a lot from like betting his jack X for a large sizing and basically kind of like value bluffing in a way, because he does have that redraw to the full house if he is behind. So we do like to call, and we come to the river of the three of spades. So bringing in a few straight flushes here, and we check to our opponent, and he bets around 2/3 pot. Kind of a weird size again. Like, it just, to me, I don't see like much merit for this sizing. In theory, if he has like a full house like Jack 5 or Jack 4, he probably just wants to bet full pot. And if he has like something like not quite as strong, maybe like a nut flush with a Jack, that hand maybe just wants to bet like half pot, for example. So um, interesting spot here. What is your sort of thoughts on the river here facing this sizing?
I thought is that you're probably going to fold because you've been folding rivers every single hand so far.
I
um,
hate calling the river, man. I never bluff. We've already talked about this. I just never bluff. So I just
yeah,
fold
yeah,
every
yeah,
river.
yeah. Okay, then it's over. End of done, GG. They never bluff.
They never
End
bluff.
of
Yeah.
discussion.
End of video.
Um, I mean, of course, Jack and Spades is a very reasonable bluff catcher here.
Mm.
As far as sizing, I'm also not so sure what to make of this. To be honest, I mean, I think on this board texture, quite often, I think you also want to go big here in these spots as in position player, but usually like there's sometimes you want to size down a little bit when there's basically when both player have a lot of nuts basically in their range, or nuts
Mm.
or second nuts or whatever. And then basically if you would like size too large, they basically need to only call like Jack 4, Jack 5, and then it doesn't make sense. Like
Mm.
if they never need to call a worse hand, then it doesn't make sense to bluff into that range basically, or to value bet thin or anything. Not saying that that's the case here though. I think here out of position is going to check raise a fair amount of Jack 4 and Jack 5 on the flop or turn. And we can quite comfortably bet full pot size here, I would say. Um, and I would say our hand is probably supposed to call. Um,
Mm.
Hard
Yeah.
to say.
Yeah, our hand, like, so on the river in general, we don't really fold that much Jack X because our opponent, in theory, when he bets like a large sizing, even if it's only 2/3, which the solver really doesn't do, he's mainly just betting half pot or pot. If he uses a large sizing, he's basically repping Jack 5 or Jack 4. So if we have the Jack, we obviously block a substantial portion of our opponent's value range, and it's kind of the same thing where we would prefer to call a hand like Jack here than we would say like a bear flush without
Yeah.
like that much in terms of blockers. So in terms of our Jack X, we're not really folding with a flush. Actually, we're not folding with a flush at all. We're folding around 20% of our Jack X in theory. But having said that, I just think people don't really bluff. It's not like a spot where it's just not a spot where like I'm like, wow, this. I really expect my opponent to just be bluffing a ton of stuff like triple barreling. I think people get very scared on paired boards. They play very passive. In general,
I'm not sure about in position, to be honest. Like, how does he not fire 3 if he has 4/5?
I mean, like I would certainly do it, and like I think it's a relatively straightforward bluff. But the thing is, like he should be bluffing Jack X a lot on the river, and I'm not convinced that people are doing that. Like, I would say that a lot of
I don't think it matters that much because one of your assumptions was also they are not finding these bets on the turn. So probably the turn barreling frequency is something like maybe some of the nut flushes, but I don't expect them to bet the river like this again. Um, and then maybe some bluffs and some boats, and then it gets just way more polarized, you know. So I'm not sure if it matters if they bluff a jack or not on the river because they usually don't have it.
Yeah, fair point. Fair point. We certainly have like again like a hand that isn't gonna fold in theory. And
With this hand, it's also I kind of make it dependent like
player.
on the player pool or like on the stakes that I'm playing. So if it's like if I'm playing a stake where people know how to bluff a little bit, then I'm more happy to call. And if it's if they're never ever bluffing, then okay, just fold.
Well, listen, on the Brazilian apps, mate, they never bluff. No, I'm just kidding. They definitely bluff. But like from what I've looked into, I think there is a lot to be said about people not bluffing on the river for a large sizing. So like pod, for example, I'm finding that when I look into my database, I mean maybe I'm just calling too much to pots, but even when I look at I should say like the database as a whole, so like the player pool, population tendencies, generally speaking, the player who bets pot on the river has an insanely high one at showdown, basically. And obviously that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not bluffing enough. That could also mean that people are calling down too wide. But I think like there is like some reason to believe that our opponents aren't finding a ton of bluffs here. Or not necessarily in this spot, but in a lot of different spots. So I did elect to fold the river. I kind of knew, like in theory, that this is probably a call with a jack and a flush, but I just couldn't do it. I really just couldn't do it. So too much pain from bluff catching the river and just being wrong every time. So maybe some psychological damage caused me to fold this one.
What I do in these spots is like, I mean, it depends how serious the fold basically is. So, how far up in your range would you say are you? Like, how often do you play Jack 4, Jack 5 this way? I guess Jack 3 you will have a fair amount, but and you're not folding Jack 3, are you?
No, of course not. Like, and I would like this hand. I think the thing as well to remember is again because our opponent is only bluffing. Oh, sorry, only value betting in theory like Jack 4 or even Jack 3 plus. He's not value betting like 5s and 4s. We would prefer to call a hand like this than we say would like 5-5 and 4-4. So I'm relatively high up in my range, and we also don't face a pot size bet. So this could, like you're saying, like I think we are relatively not like insanely high. I think I definitely have like Jack 5 and Jack 4 and also Jack 3 a fair amount of the time. If I don't have like strong overcards, I'm just gonna check call that. So I probably play these boards also too passive from like not check raising enough. So I think I am relatively high in my range. It is kind of
The
difficult to advocate for a fold when you do think about it like that.
the problem is also that if or like the problem is if you have Jack 4, Jack 5, they will very rarely have a bluff because their bluffs will probably contain a 4 or a 5. So when you call them down with Jack 4, Jack 5, you will usually they will maybe have a thinner value bet or maybe a chop or whatever.
Mm,
But you will not super frequently see them bluffing
mm,
it off when you have Jack 4 or Jack 5. Um, and so what I like to do in these spots where I feel like, okay, the population is probably not bluffing here enough and it's kind of tough, but the problem is, will I ever find out if they are over bluffing or not if I never call with like my bluff catcher, you know? And um so what I do is, and I think Fedor Holz talked about this as well in one of his video for No Limit Hold'em, is that if you have a spot where you like this, where you're considering like a very very strong hand, think about, okay, do you ever have like the nuts here or whatever, like a very strong hand where you at least get to see some showdowns and then you're able to
mm,
make some adjustments. And if not, or if those hands are very few, consider calling a strong hand like this at a frequency. For example, what I do then is like I randomize and call it like 15% of the time, you know?
mm,
Where it's like, okay, he's probably under bluffing, but like you still like you don't want to get him. First of all, you don't want to let him like feel like, oh, this guy's folding every river. I mean, people will know now anyway after this video that you're folding every river. but um but yeah, but it also like it makes you, at least you get to see some showdowns and you will be able to make some adjustments, of
mm.
course. And then if after a few showdowns it's like, okay, yes, this guy's never bluffing, okay, then you can start folding everything again, but at least you will sometimes call and yeah, prevent from being totally run over.
Yeah, I think that's like definitely a good tip that I haven't really thought about before. So it's nice to know that, and hopefully, like everyone watching the video might be able to utilize that. But
And
we've
you can also play around with this frequency a little bit. So basically, like if you're super convinced this guy's never bluffing, but there's a little bit of doubt, okay, just randomize and call him 1 or 2% of the time, you know.
mm,
But if there's a high chance this guy could be bluffing, but you're just not sure, and like people are in general not bluffing enough on in your pool, maybe you want to call this hand like 50% of the time or whatever. You know, you can basically, based on how strong your read is, you can elect to randomize.
mm. Yeah, certainly. All right, guys. Well, that's the last hand we have. Certainly done quite a long video. Is to be expected when we do a little dual review. So hopefully you guys got a lot out of the video. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.
Bye bye.